Good afternoon. I'm Harold Holzer, director of the Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, president of Hunter College, it's a pleasure to welcome you to one of the more exciting events we've done on lockdown or even live. And that is a celebration, really, a welcoming party for the first one-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt in 6 decades. And it's going to be a particular thrill to hear this evening from the author of that book, David Michaelis. I wish this event was in person. I know I say that about every Zoom event that we do and have done since April, but I particularly would have loved to take David Michaelis through Roosevelt House to the home that Eleanor moved into in 1908 and lived in for 25 years, as most of our audience knows. It is here that she faced one of her great early challenges, and that was, of course, negotiating the cramped space of 2 side-by-side twin townhouses with her formidable mother-in-law, Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt, who, as you probably know, if you've come to Roosevelt House events before, you know that Sarah immediately took down the walls separating the 2 townhouses once she had importuned Eleanor and Franklin to move in 1908. And as Eleanor once kind of wistfully wrote some years later, her mother-in-law was thereafter on her side of the house, well, as she put it, for the next 25 years. But it's also important to remember that Eleanor also, here in our building, nursed her husband Franklin back to health after he had suffered from the epidemic of the day, polio, nursing him back to health devotedly, considering that their marriage had fallen on hard times at that period, and worked with him as he then became governor of New York and, of course, was elected president of the United States. Eleanor was used to confronting challenging situations behind the walls and behind the doors of Roosevelt House. It's important to note, too, and I think instructive, that in 1943, in the first year of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, after the death of his mother, decided to sell this building to Hunter College. But he was en route to Casablanca for the summit meeting there on the day of the ceremony. So it was Eleanor who represented Franklin at that 1943 event, saying that she was hopeful that the House continue to reflect the diversity and the striving for equality and opportunity that had reflected her family's life in that building. Eleanor continued to visit Roosevelt House, to visit Hunter College for the next 2 decades, was befriended and was a mentor to many of the women who attended Hunter, including our own chairman of the advisory board, Rita Holzer, who I hope is tuning in this evening. Rita told Eleanor Roosevelt that her father did not think women should go to law school. And when she told Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor wrote a letter to her father saying, "This woman belongs in law school." And we have Eleanor to thank for Rita's extraordinary legal career, UN career, and her wonderful career as our leader at Roosevelt House. So thank you, Eleanor Roosevelt, for that, among many other miracles. And thank you, Rita, for supporting us. And Rita, you have to find that letter. I know you haven't looked for it that hard. It has to be in the Roosevelt House archive. So if you're listening, have a look during the quarantine period for this extraordinary letter. Our special guest tonight is the author of Eleanor, the book I hope you see behind me. He is David Michaelis, an award-winning biographer of both Charles Schulz and Peanuts, by the way, a joint biography, and the artist N.C. Wyeth. He's much honored for his work. He spent years and years working on Eleanor for his extraordinary editor, my one-time editor, the late Alice Mayhew. And now we've reached the point where the book is here. Alice would have been in the front row at Roosevelt House for this event had several circumstances been different. The book has already been endorsed by 2 historians par excellence who have spoken at Roosevelt House several times, Michael Beschloss and Walter Isaacson. And I was interested in seeing that both of them used the same kind of phrase in praising the book, that it was the perfect biography for our times. We'll let that settle in and we'll let that unfold in the discussion period, but I think we know what they meant. We also have the perfect interlocutor and conversation leader for this discussion, our friend Allida Black, who is the editor of the Eleanor Roosevelt papers, has written her own book about Eleanor, casting her own shadow, and wrote an introduction and re-edited one of Eleanor's own books, What I Want to Leave Behind. Allida is also on the board of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library and Museum in Hyde Park. And every appearance she has made at Roosevelt House to discuss Eleanor has been an extraordinary treat for all of our guests. We have hundreds of people online tonight, so I'm excited to turn it over to our speakers. Let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. There will be a moderated Q&A session at the end of our program. All you need to do is type in your questions on the Q&A function of your laptop or desktop, and they will be reviewed and asked by Mac Barrett, the head of our curator of programming at Roosevelt House, at the end of the event. I also urge you to go into our chat room for a brand new feature beginning this evening. Our authors' books will be available via a direct link to our partnering bookstore, Hunter's Neighbor Shakespeare and Company, and I'm happy to announce that all of the books tonight are available with a signed book plate from the author, David Michaelis. So welcome, participate in the Q&A and our traditional book signing back in a new way starting this evening. And with that, I'm happy to introduce Allida Black in conversation with David Michaelis on Eleanor.
Hi, Allida.
Hey, David, how are you? I'm so happy to see you.
So
and
happy.
I know that that you have some slides that you would like to share, but I would just like to tell the audience that being the dedicated historians that David and I are, we always believe in setting the context. And Harold has done such a fine job in explaining the glories of Roosevelt House. David, I think with your visuals and your research, we can really overcome this digital divide and bring everybody inside. So I await your introductions.
Thank you, Allida. And thank you, Harold Holzer. Thank you, Daniel Culkin. Thank you, Magdalena Mazurek, Nuevo. Thank you, Mac Barrett. Thank you to the whole Roosevelt House team. We're so happy to be here. And I'm really have a special debt of gratitude to you, Dr. Black, to Allida Black, for all the support in coming today, but especially Allida Black is one of the scholars on whose shoulders and strong and big ones they are that I stand and have stood for the last 10 years. Your work has been enormously foundational for mine. I wanted to show just a couple of pictures here just to set a context. Really what we're looking at in Roosevelt House is the follow-on for Eleanor and Franklin from this house. This was the first house. This is on East 36th Street, and Franklin called it their 14-foot mansion. It's the middle townhouse there, you see, and it's even smaller than you think. Franklin was 6'1", Eleanor was about 5'11", and if they stood side by side with their arms out, as in calisthenics, they would practically have touched wall to wall together. This was the house that the minute they moved in, Franklin's mother had already not only rented it, but had signed the lease and had furnished it and had set it up. Eleanor was walking into the first house of her marriage with everything already in place, and as it turned out, pregnant too. So the family was already expanding the minute they moved in here, and both Franklin and his mother kept insisting that it was just too small. I think Eleanor actually loved it. and yet its days were numbered when on Christmas, as a Christmas present to Franklin and Eleanor, Mama, Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt, presented this sort of conceptual idea that there would be a house. Now, if you look at the drawing on the left, the trick here is that looks like a house. That's a family's house. What is not visible in the drawing, and what became visible when Charles Platt, one of the sort of tonier patrician architects, had done his work, he created what I always looked at and thought of as a Chinese box. Because from the outside, you're seeing what looks like with that single entrance. Your eye is trained to think, I'm going into a house. Well, actually, what you're going into, and these pictures don't quite do it justice, but when you enter that forbidding, or formidable, I should say, gate, and walk up the stairs, you're entering a box that has an entrance to its right and an entrance to its left. And as Harold Holzer made clear, what you really are entering into, and I wish I had actually, no, sorry, I thought that was going to be my floor plan, but I don't have it. But you're entering into a twin side-by-side domain in which I was fascinated by this. By the third and fourth floor, the panels of certain rooms, which were shared space, could be slid back. And at night, one Roosevelt grandchild, I believe it was Buzzy, Anna's son, got lost. I mean, it was so disorienting that to be on one side of the house at night and not the side of the house you'd been on before. He got lost and just sat down and started to cry, waiting for someone to come and find him. And Eleanor's experience of the house, which Harold Holzer also referred to, was that her mother-in-law wasn't just in the house. Eleanor, for instance, would leave when she unpacked the house. One of her nomadic tribal skills, she had to move so often, was that when she moved someplace, she moved right in fast. Everything got opened up, everything got put in its place, and that's how she established the new spot, the new home. She put her favorite vase on one side of the mantelpiece in the drawing room, I believe on the second, maybe the third floor. And when she came back next, hours later, it had been moved to the other side. So she moved it back to its place. When she next went by, her eye was just suddenly taken by the fact that it had been moved again. So she never knew where anything was going to be at any given time, least of all her mother-in-law. And Franklin, I think, moved as he did through everything with ease and grace. This is the house, as Harold Holzer mentioned, where Eleanor and Louis Howe, seen there, fought for Franklin's, and Franklin himself was waging his secret battle to remain in New York at the house there instead of returning to Hyde Park, where his mother wanted to essentially turn him into the slightly invalided world that his father had occupied the last years of his life. Louis Howe and Eleanor were were signing correspondence, moving on the committees that Franklin had been involved in. For much that the world knew, Franklin was still very much a power in New York State politics. One of my strong feelings about the house when I went through it myself, and I took this really rather bad cell phone photograph, I just felt that the light that the architect Platt had designed, dropping down in this almost Italian courtyard, suffused all the rooms and hallways with this very airy, light, pearly light. It was almost like a kind of room you'd want to meditate in or pray in or just simply take a nap in. And I thought it had a very restful quality, which was such an antithesis to the high tension of these incredibly ambitious people at incredible moments, literally, of American history. This is the house where Franklin and Eleanor emerged as President-elect and First Lady-elect the morning after Hoover's concession. It's an incredibly important house, and yet it does have this sort of lovely light always permeating it. This was what the balcony might have looked like in another parallel universe. I happened to see these signs on a building in New York. It just simply said, Eleanor's building, she who must be obeyed. And I thought, well, in another world, this is what might have hung outside of 4749 East 76, because I was quite surprised to discover in the tax real estate records of the the House and in the census, that Eleanor was really, well, Franklin and his mother were considered heads of household by their status in the census. Eleanor was merely wife, and I thought it sort of defined exactly, and people thought of it as Sarah Roosevelt's townhouse, and it must be remembered that that is how she lived there, and yet she did triumph, persist, and transcend, and this is sort of more or less how I had wished the building would ultimately be seen. And that's all I have right now on Roosevelt House, and back to Allida.
Well, I can't wait to get started. So, David, I have a heartfelt question to ask you.
Yes.
You've written 2 extraordinary biographies of Charles Schulz / Peanuts, and another one of N.C. Wyeth, 2 very distinct and very male artists. How did your work on those 2 phenomenal men prepare you to reconstruct such a complicated woman's life? And why did you pick Eleanor?
Great question, because as you who have written at least 6 and more books know, one does follow from the other. And with N.C. Wyeth and Charles Schulz, classic males of the 20th century, and fairly narcissistic, their lives were perfect structures for biography, because they go out and out and out and come to a place of great success and realization and fulfillment, and then narrow, 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 narrow. And Eleanor Roosevelt's life starts out narrow, narrow, it narrows again, it narrows again, and then it just opens out, 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 out. So how do you end a book that just keeps, anyhow, I realized I was in a different part of the planet, and that it was going to be incredibly challenging and exciting. One of the reasons that I chose Eleanor, and this is, it sounds calculating, because there's an inner heartfelt part that is also as important, but I literally wanted to write a non-access biography. Both the Wyeths and the Schultzes were in different ways complicated and wonderful and complicated versions of why getting involved with a family to write a biography about the patriarch of the family is a complicated business. I really thought with Eleanor that I could walk into, and indeed one can, into the FDR library and go into a place where 1 million documents were just waiting for me, or you. And in fact, it was the me or you that I loved. I loved that already it was a democratic process, and I didn't need special access to suddenly be doing what we love to do, which is bury ourselves in the primary documents, the letters and the diaries, and that no one had to hand them. I thought that it would give me a much closer relationship to her. And I wanted the book to be different from all other Eleanor books, all other biographies and historiographies, because I wanted the reader to feel that they were seeing her and getting close to her for who she was and as she saw herself, and try to take out as much of the distortion as possible. I mean, biography is a distortion. It's a distortion both of the time in which it's written, the time it's published, the time that the author has lived in. So it's a series of overlays onto a life. And I thought, actually, strangely, the internet gave me the first chance that I recognized, because I always thought the internet is a bit peculiar for me. But I thought, well, I can now follow Eleanor through 12 newspapers a day. I can get right down on the ground in real time and see what the reporters were writing about her. I can get, and this was the big thing, and this is not just a backhanded compliment, but because of Allida Black and the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers Project, I could get to my day, her column every single day. And that was enormous window that opened every day of my research and writing life with looking through the world as Eleanor saw it. And that is a astonishing document begun in 1935, as you know, and ending just with her death, with about 5 days off after Franklin Roosevelt died. And it shows you that here's a woman really live blogging, we would now say, her thoughts and feelings. She wasn't a gushing confessional. She used very plain style, and the plainer and more restrained her style, the more her emotions poured through. And that you find, I think, in some of the great American writers, like unexpectedly great writers like Ulysses S. Grant, using very plain style to write about very emotional, fraught events. Eleanor was constantly in the middle, I thought, of action and fraught emotional life, but was able to simplify and contain it. And I think in that way, it established, because it was a daily column, established one of the principles of her life, a principle of democracy, the principle of reciprocity, that your feelings, that your life was as important as hers, and that she could share hers with you, which is a form of compliment for a fame. I mean, fame in those days was different. It was much bigger. She was a much bigger figure than a famous person or a celebrity. She was a world figure. And so for her to share the humdrum seeming details of her life was to say, you're important to me, and I really recognize in you that I am very much like you.
And she would also, sorry, David, go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
she would also use my day, to follow up on your point, to amplify the voices of her readers. I mean, if there was one column that addressed a reader's letter, there were 1,000. And she did an extraordinary, over 8,000 columns. So it's not just her voice, as you so cogently and passionately described, it's also the voices she heard that she tried to bring before the American people, which brings me to my second question, my new friend. Okay, reconstructing such a complex and rich life in one volume is not only a daunting task, it's a monumental task. Because as you pointed out earlier, Eleanor's life covers the Spanish-American War, the Progressive Era, World War I, the 20s, the Great Depression, World War II, the beginning of the modern human rights movement, the Cold War, and the beginning of the Kennedy era. So it is incredibly difficult to marshal all of this information. And what I think the major strength of your book is, and to the audience, just forgive me, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool political historian. And I believe that America does not understand its historic past. And so one of the strengths of your book, David, is how you vividly and with accuracy describe what life in Allenswood was like. Flesh out the story behind the 1928 phone call that Eleanor places to Franklin to get him to accept the call to run for governor of New York. You flesh out the 1936 meeting with Bethune and Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama at the Southern Conference for Human Welfare. You depict her debate with Wyszynski at the UN so well that I feel like I'm standing in the floor of the UN. So here's my author to author, historian to historian question for you. And it's two parts. The first one is, what was the most challenging episode for you to reconstruct? That's the first one. And the second one was, what do you wish that you could have included, but Alice made you leave on the cutting room floor?
Oh boy, let's go to the second first. Alice warned me that she was going to be incredibly demanding of my of a manuscript. She wanted to see manuscript. So actually, I showed her a great deal more preliminarily than I ever would have before. So she began pulling at it at once. I think the thing that probably, well, it's a bit of a long story, but I did discover very early on, what I wanted to find out was, why was Eleanor Roosevelt's father, not why was he an alcoholic, I think the disease speaks for itself, but why did his alcoholism affect those around him the way that it did, and what was really going on. And I discovered it took me backward, and it took me backward, and it took me back into his parents' life. And to make a long story short, I discovered that the medications that his parents were using, which were mercury-based, had caused serious problems in the family, on top of the fact that, Eleanor's grandfather, Elliot's father, the first Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a mirror maker. They had a hardware store. The old Roosevelt hardware store on Maiden Lane made mirrors. There was lots of mercury coming home in little jars and so forth. Anyhow, it took me into a 300-page panel that showed what the Roosevelts of New York City, who they were and what they did and why they created this very complex man, Theodore Roosevelt, and this very fragile man, Elliot Roosevelt. And I gave it to Alice, and she said, "This is fascinating. How could everyone have missed this? This is wonderful. Where does your book on Eleanor begin?" And so out it went.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the way it goes. And it was fascinating, and I could not bear the thought of it, but that's what you do. You just move right on. The one that I think was most difficult for me, polio was very difficult for me to write about. I really admired what Jeff Ward did with that, because he had experience. He had polio.
Yeah, he's the best. Sorry.
Yeah, remarkable. And so I could trust him, and there's several others, particularly alums of Warm Springs. I felt it was a moment that required great understanding that I was worried that I wouldn't have, because Eleanor both had to felt all the things she felt for him in the aftermath of great alienation, marital alienation, and at the same time she must have felt enormous relief that this was actually giving her freedom that she craved and needed, and which in fact paradoxically, the more freedom she took from Franklin at the time, the greater his chances of recovery, the greater their chances of forming a partnership that was real and vital. And so everything was counterintuitive. And I think just trying to, there's always 3 or 4, it's like one of those triple chess games of the 70s on plexiglass. There are always 3 or 4 chess games going in the Roosevelts' lives, and to try to accurately convey those to the reader so that they would understand Eleanor's point of view was my challenge with that, and tough.
Yeah, tough. So, sorry. Now, I warned you before that I was going to pull out some of my favorite Eleanor quotes that you used in the book. So I would like to introduce the audience to my favorite quote from 1929. And she said it in early January. And I just would like the viewers to remember that FDR has just been elected governor, that Eleanor is known as one of the most powerful Democratic women in New York State, and that she is struggling with trying to figure out how her career can continue as his takes off. Because as David points out, you know, they're never together more than 6 months a year after polio strikes, because FDR is always trying to find a cure. She is out being his advocate as well as advocating for things that she cares about. So here's the quote. "I expect to solve problems as they come along. That has always been my way. And things always get done." So my question to you, David, is what 2 or 3 problems did she address, and how did her action shape policies or shape her life?
At that particular time?
Whatever, from 29 to 62, you pick.
Listening, I think became part of every job description. I think she developed a deep listening that allowed her to catch up very quickly on subjects that she didn't yet know. Men tend to jump right in thinking they need to solve the problem and or know the answer immediately. I think Eleanor had the great technique, first of all, of listening. And then second of all, I don't think she reacted until she had a plan, but I think she always said right off, well, something must be done. We must do it. And I think she didn't yet know what that was, but her ability to stay fluid and spontaneous in a situation without being assertive off the top gave her an automatic advantage over most of the men that she was working with. And I think she also knew that she had the power of catching someone up short by just addressing them very quickly on what was really the truth. She was not afraid to catch someone up a little bit, but in a kind way, not seeking to judge or to condemn. And I think that also made men, took men off guard. They were expecting to have a fight. They were disarmed. And she had an ability. Most men had thought of her as someone they wouldn't necessarily be attracted to. When they discovered that she was extremely radiant and attractive in person, that she could put the seduction on you with simply a smile, or I mean, Franklin was much more an overt seducer. Eleanor, I don't think of as a seducer, but she could win you over with a look. She could also frost you with a look. But her eyes, when they were warm and dancing, when her smile was at 1,000 watts, you melted. It was irresistible. And a lot of men, I noticed actually in keeping a kind of, you keep little almanacs of these subjects, the number of men who were from Ernest Hemingway to Brendan Gill, who made record of how disarmed they were by her sheer magnetism, really, her presence. So I think that those personal techniques always, but overall, I think the approach that she took again and again was to be the proxy of the people, or the proxy of the cause that she was fighting for, and without question, keeping the larger mission in mind and saying we're here for the good, for the good of the people. We're here for the goodwill. We are here for the Empire State. We're here for the United States. Her mission was always the larger one, and she always was the representative of whomever she was there for, and not for herself. It was never about her.
And as you point out in the book, there are times that she was quite assertive in rocking the boat when speaking out. I mean, her very shrewd, I think, assessment of Churchill, which you depict, and her ability to have a very impolitic speech that Churchill was going to give, basically kiboshed by the British embassy. And as I mentioned earlier, her extraordinary debate with Wyszynski on the floor of the UN. And you do a very fine job of reconstructing that fight, which is really what it was. It was these two titans, audiences, listeners, who were really at the top of their game, duking it out over refugees on the floor of the United Nations. And what David has done, that not one single biographer of Eleanor that I've read or assessment of her work at the UN does, is really put you in the seat as you watch them go toe to toe. And the inflection that Eleanor has when she finally cuts the Soviet debater off at the knees, as David so cogently says, it's not about government. The UN is not about the rights of government. The UN is about the rights of men. At which point Wyszynski is speechless. And to go back to the point that David made, is that, Eleanor does not want to leave him angry, because she knows they have to work together. So as David recounts, she goes back up to Wyszynski, and says, I hope that someday, I'm loosely paraphrasing, we will be on the same side because you are a fierce fighter. And he smiles at her and says, as you are too. And so that's another little insight into how David fleshes out these complicated political issues. And so I just...
Allida, I wanted to say about that, just to quickly follow on.
Sure, absolutely.
And it was one of my challenges too, to go to your earlier question, which is, when Eleanor became a global statesman, she had the United States' interest first and foremost, and she had to do things, simplify it by saying, when the NAACP realized that civil rights had not served them and that maybe human rights would, they made a point of taking a 155-page report by the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois and bringing it forward. It was a record of the inhumanity of the United States toward African Americans for 200 years. And the NAACP wanted to introduce it to the UN, not as a formal complaint, but as a record, so that the UN would have to take it. Eleanor could, it's exactly the document that she would love to have, or she would like to have been the sponsor of. She couldn't sponsor that document. It was contra the US position. It would open her up to Wyszynski's attacks, those things that she might automatically have supported. A complaint by India, for instance, against South Africa, she couldn't support because it went against UN rules, or she was very, very careful about making sure that she did not trespass over the United Nations, the new structures in place, but especially the United States position.
Well, I would tweak that just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are new friends if you don't have a little affectionate sparring match here?
You bet.
know, I would say that Eleanor didn't always follow the UN position, that she used My Day in a way, her daily newspaper column, in a way that no diplomat could ever use before or since. You know, if she disagreed with what the United States position was in committee, she would state her personal position in My Day. But when, you know, to pick up your point with Du Bois, which you also talk about, which you carry through, I mean, Eleanor really goes toe to toe with the Soviets, civil rights as human rights, and browbeats the United States into including planks in the UN articles in the Declaration that attack Jim Crow, which brings me to, I'm happy to say, a segue into my next question for you. Because once again, you trace Eleanor's evolution, you know, from an insecure child to the foremost advocate and a field marshal, if you will, of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to her appointment with JFK. And you write, I'd like to read one of the sentences that you wrote, and then because I think it's so encompassing of what you're trying to do in the volume, and have you elaborate on it some more. You write, as ER's activism evolved, she did not see herself reaching out to solve social problems so much as engaging with individuals to unravel discontinuities. And the discontinuities were from the old order and modernity. Could you unpack that for us and give us some examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was trying to do there was essentially go to the core of this idea of democracy, that each person's is of equal value, and that you're going to have a reciprocal arrangement in between your government and the individual. And I think Eleanor, as always, was seeking to represent the government to an individual as that it belonged to you. It belonged to her, and it belonged to you. I'm not sure if I have. I'm not sure if I have examples on the top of my head. Can you just read me the last part of the quote again?
Sure. It says, to unravel the discontinuities between the old order and modernity. I mean, for example, I mean, when I read this, I thought that this described your portrayal of Eleanor's evolution on race. I mean, you were very clear with the Afro-American newspaper, the Afro-American News, really holding Eleanor accountable for her use of darky. When her secretary writes her response to Eleanor's evolution, to being a foremost advocate of civil rights in the UN in the 1950s and fighting with Jack Kennedy. So I guess that's what I was, looking for.
I see, absolutely. The episode with the African American took place in 1937 when she published her autobiography. And I think it's a great, you've put your finger on a great moment where the old order is making its last stand, because by 1941, certainly by 1943 in the race riots in Detroit, by 1943, you have Thurgood Marshall saying, if you want to know courage, it's the First Lady of the United States standing alone and standing up during the Detroit race riots to take the side of the rioters. And that's where Eleanor was by 43. In 1937, she published an autobiography, and in a way, it's her kryptonite, it's her weakness. When she wanted so much to protect her father and her father's reputation and the past that her father represented, that when she described a 39-year-old stable hand who had worked for her father in her father's terrible disgrace and dying year, in his last year as his caretaker, making sure that in his alcoholism he wouldn't tip over a lamp and burn the house down. She described that man as my father's darky coachman. She immediately got blowback from and rightly so, from the editor of the Baltimore Afro-American, who said, Mrs. Roosevelt, you are the one we come to and we look to for support, and we cannot imagine that you don't all know already that this is a hurtful expression and epithet, and we ask you to apologize. And as you mentioned, she actually didn't make the apology directly. She let her assistant do it. What she gave as her excuse or her reasoning was that this was language that was not intended to be racial, and that it came out of a place of affection from the old plantation. Well, the old plantation where her grandmother had lived was a slaveholding plantation with as many horrors as any other place where enslaved peoples were being held. So Eleanor was holding on one last time to a sentimentality that had been handed to her.
Well, yeah. I would say that, it was I think you're right in terms of it was the story for her, but at the same time, people had already tried to kill her for her stand on racial justice.
Yes.
I mean, the Klan had already attacked her in both North and South Carolina. So there's a disconnect here. I think, your point about how she associates this with her father, is that the real vulnerability here, but she learns. And the thing about Eleanor, as you point out, is that, she's not going to make the same mistake twice. No. She may not own up to it now, but she will own up to it later. And I know that there are a gazillion questions from the audience, but I have to thank you for one thing and ask you a wrap-up question. Okay, the first thing I have to thank you for is please thank Simon & Schuster for me for all those footnotes. I cannot tell you how important that is. I know from painful experience how long you have to fight with publishers to include documentation, and the fact that you did that and they're so clear so that people can trace your work is of really invaluable support to us who work on her. Okay, so here's my favorite Eleanor question. Okay, thank you, Jonathan Hart. So here's my favorite question that I've asked Blanche, that I've asked Doris, I've asked John Meacham, everybody who's worked on Eleanor. What did Eleanor teach you? You spent 11 years of your life reconstructing hers. What did she teach you as you went through this?
Makes absolutely, there's no point whatsoever in judging another person. In that person, you will find parts of yourself. There's a compassion, there's so much pain in the world right now. And I think in the world she lived in, there was so much pain. And I think the way she handled that pain in herself and in the world was to find the other in the other that was very much like herself. And I think she always looked into somebody and saw herself and was able to see others without any narcissism whatsoever, with a real reaching into another person's feelings and into their life, and making bold leaps to do so. And I think she made me a bolder person in terms of trying to share humanity with other people. I think she felt, for instance, that there wasn't a single person in the world that she couldn't learn something from if she spent enough time and listened. And I think listening and being with people changed for me in the course of the time I was writing this book.
What a glorious tribute to her, but what a fine thing about you.
Thank you.
So I would now like to go to Mac to see what the audience has in store for us.
Thank you both for this extraordinary conversation. We do have a lot of questions coming in. First and foremost, a question from Roosevelt House Director Harold Holzer. Can both of you talk about Eleanor's extraordinary run of White House press conferences, almost as many as FDR's 1,000 sessions? Did her press sessions help advance FDR's policies or her own priorities, or both?
I'd say right off, they helped advance the cause, right, first and foremost, of the women's rights to press freedom and to be on a level with men at the time, where if Eleanor couldn't really break news, but she could say things that hadn't been said elsewhere, and she would give the reporters in the women's only press conference a leg up on at least one story coming out of Washington that day. Allida, do you have?
Yeah, I would say first, it helped women keep their jobs, which was a masterful way to not only help women, but ensure favorable coverage of yourself and your husband. And so it's benevolent and shrewd at the same time. There, I think they helped both of them. She would, as David referenced, she broke news about 3.2% beer, but she also later would use press conferences to goad FDR. I mean, my favorite is the fight over the Economy Act of 1933, when basically FDR says, I'm going to do this act, and Eleanor comes out and says, no, you're not going to do this act, it's going to hurt women. And they have dueling op-eds. So, while predominantly her press conferences were to, as she would say, introduce women to the life of the nation, it's predominantly for FDR, but she wasn't adverse to putting in her own issues there too. Harold, I hope that answers your question, my friend.
Here's a question from Robert. First, a statement. Even though FDR realized how much Miss Roosevelt did for him in his career, did he ever think of her as an equal? Was his attitude toward her one of appreciation or something else?
David.
Well, I was just thinking of the time when Eleanor asked him if he would have any problem with her going public, going forward in a press conference with a particular point of view. And his response was, you say whatever comes to mind, whatever you want to say. I can always say I can't handle you. And in some ways, there was a respect there. Well, there was, I think, deeply a respect as time went on. But I even think publicly, he respected her, although he made light of her. He used her as a foil, sometimes almost as a burlesque foil. The whole idea of, please God, let Eleanor oversleep so we'll all get some rest around here, or please God, let Eleanor stay in the White House one night. There was a sort of over caricature. It was a caricature that Eleanor was somehow always leaping out and doing things beyond his reach. She never wanted to embarrass him, and I think she took great pains, but she did on almost every point that she disagreed with him on, as Allida said a moment ago, would goad him and find ways to do so.
question from an unnamed person. Was there a defining moment when Eleanor became openly involved in Franklin's political career? And if so, what were the circumstances of that moment?
Well, I found a moment that would be a very primitive version that I thought was fascinating, which is that when Eleanor and Franklin were engaged, they had to keep their engagement secret for a year per the instructions of Franklin's mother, who was hoping it would all just go away. It didn't go away. And during that time, in 1904, Franklin graduated from college. He lost his first election as class marshal of his Harvard class, but there was another election to a seat on a Harvard board of overseers or some such type board. And it was an elected office and it required a speech. And I came across a letter in which Eleanor, writing to Franklin, says, I can well imagine you hanging around the polls that day, ha ha ha. But listen, you're going to have to give that speech, and please make sure you make a carbon and send me the copy. I want to look it over and give you my notes. It began even before they were married that she would be she was the iron frame on which his ambitions could be stretched. And I think that you see it when he jumps in to the race for the state assembly and state senate in Albany, although she didn't really do much more than watch what he was doing. I think the first time really was 1921, 22, 23, 24, in those years when she began using the automobile to go around the state, the vast distances of the Empire State, to organize women who had just finally been given the right to vote.
Could I add one thing to that? Is that all right? I think too, as David pointed out, Albany really is a formative experience for her, because not only is that when Louis Howe, FDR's great mentor, shows up, and really the architect of FDR's political career shows up, but it's when Eleanor begins to understand how government works. And so as she hosts dinner parties and has committee meetings over in their welcomes assemblymen when they come in to discuss different policies, she begins to see the horse trade that goes on. And while she's not happy about it, the horse trading, it punctures her idealism. She does really begin to see a sense of how government works and how she can be of help to him. And I think that really emerges during World War I when he's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But as David rightly emphasizes, it's really when she is able to get her own voice back after FDR gets polio, when she can really begin to advise him more thoroughly.
I would add one more thing, which is on the Franklin Roosevelt was the Democratic Party's vice presidential candidate in 1920, primarily because of his magic name, but also because of the League of Nations, which they thought would be a theme. It was a theme. However, when Eleanor joined reluctantly, the campaign train swinging through the West, new forms of advanced teams and so forth were beginning to shape how the message would go out. Franklin was a bit, let's say, was a bit lazy actually, and would be playing poker at night in the car with his cufflinks crew team of campaign advisors. And one night, Louis Howe needed a paragraph on the League of Nations for tomorrow morning's speech. He had gotten word back by telegraph from the advance team that this next town on the whistle stop tour, a good place for the League of Nations, what should be said. Franklin was playing poker, and Louis Howe brought the speech he was planning back to Eleanor's cabin. She had not had a knock on the door the entire time. She often thought, what am I doing on this train? Louis Howe came in and said, I need you to look at the speech. She rewrote the paragraph on the League of Nations. She heard her husband give it the next day. It was intoxicating. She heard her own corrections in words suddenly going into the conversation, into the vox populi of the moment from the whistle stop from the back of the train. And I think they, not only did Louis continue to bring her issues through that campaign, but she saw the action that and heard how her voice could harmonize.
We have a couple people asking about Japanese internment policy, Cheryl Smiley and Deborah Gardner, Roosevelt House's own historian. Deborah, thanks to you, David, for finally providing a one-volume biography of Eleanor, which so many guests of Roosevelt House ask about. And she says that one instance where Eleanor disagreed with Franklin was on the issue of Japanese internment, but that she kept her silence due to the fact that the country was at war. Can you provide any more background on this disagreement?
Well, I would add that the Attorney General of the United States, Francis Biddle, was the one who, when given Roosevelt's executive order to vet, said, listen, Mr. President, and here he was literally echoing something Eleanor had already warned her husband about privately, which was, if you do this, another president years from now might do exactly the same thing. And it was used by the current administration when children were caged at the border, when unpopular policies have been put forward by executive order. This administration has quoted the fact that Franklin Roosevelt would inter Japanese Americans in 1941. Biddle foresaw this. Franklin shrugged it off. He felt always, I think, that he had a feeling about the people and where he could read the country and he could read the mood. And he read, I think, overread into Japanese, California's, the state of California's particular obsession at that moment. The state officials were in high gear, anti-Japanese, predicting that there would be all kinds of takeovers, spying, various things that were other commissions had flatly denied and said, this is overkill. Eleanor also understood that it would be overkill. It gravely saddened her. She did do the right thing in the sense that she made her point of view clear, but she could not be another voice besides the administration's in this as it was unfolding. She went, of course, to make visits, and I think those were Band-Aids. I don't think they were all that successful from her point of view. I don't know, Allida, do you have a feeling about her point of view?
I do, actually. Hey, Deborah, good question. I wish I could see your face. I'd wave to you. I think Eleanor was very publicly opposed to internment until FDR signs the executive order. I mean, she travels to California, speaks out against it, goes to Washington State and appears with Japanese American citizens at rallies and says, this is no time for hyphenates, we're all Americans. She, once FDR signed the executive order, in the great 3 Ps of writing, possibly, perhaps, or probably being, I would bet my mortgage, my car payment, and my paltry butt IRA, FDR probably said to her, and this is wartime, you will not cross me. But by 1943, when the riots break out in the Manzanar camps, Eleanor can no longer, be quiet. She writes in my day, it chills my soul to think of American children, American citizens behind barbed wire. She, tries to get men out of the camps who want to enlist, but FDR says, no, 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 no. She even corresponds with Justice Denton in California to make sure that she understands his dissent in the case that will become the Manzanar camp that will go before the United States Supreme Court. But, she She does not travel the country after 43 on saying this is wrong. She does after FDR dies and we are in the throes of the Declaration, she will use internment as an example of America's darkest hour. So as David would say, you know, this is an example of the limits of her power as a non-appointed resident and non-elected resident of the White House.
Let's see. How about Richard Cohen's question? How did Eleanor respond to FDR's amorous adventures?
David, that's you.
Fine. I am ever amazed at the modernity of the Roosevelt marriage, especially as it encompassed. FDR adored her Eleanor's two first political friends with whom she lived at Valkill for a time, Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman. He was avuncular and kind to them and included them in a lot of his own thinking and was always soliciting their opinions and their points of view. Lorena Hickok, he actually warned Eleanor about because he knew what a smart, shrewd, canny person he was. But his overall, his point of view about women and about the women that Eleanor loved was tolerance. He was very tolerant. He was he would kiddingly call Valkill the love shack. He was, you know, it was somewhat patronizing in a certain way, but that was FDR. He was always a bit of the sixth form bully, as well as the charmer. I think he looked on Eleanor as he would always speak of her when he saw her in an evening gown as his wife at his most beautiful. He took pride in her publicly, and I think that as he looked upon the world, their separate lives, he had exactly what he wanted. I think there was no, he continued to see Lucy Mercer, we now know. He continued to deceive her and move behind her back. I think he looked on the life she was leading as a relief to him and a boon to her.
You mentioned Valkill. A couple of people have asked about the significance of Valkill to Eleanor and her accomplishments and life. Michael Burns specifically asks, did you make any unique discoveries about her relationship to this special site during your research?
Well, I felt only that I was discovering what is known, but it became emphatic to me, which is that it was presented as a place of Eleanor's political awakening, and indeed it was, but it was also very definitely the place of her disconnection from her mother-in-law. That in fact, its entire purpose was to create a kind of flanking move so that when Franklin was home, she could come and stay at the big house at Hyde Park with Franklin under his mother's roof, but that she would live her own life. And it was barely acknowledged in some ways with her mother-in-law, but it was a distinct cutting of the tie. And it was therefore, I think the only other insight that really made sense to me about it was that need to do for others, her need to be useful to others, was thrown into high relief by the Valkill industries. Nancy Cook came back from the war, having made, Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman were Eleanor's partners in Valkill. Nancy Cook came back from the war, having learned how to make wooden legs for amputees. Working in wood was a skill of hers. Eleanor wanted her to develop that skill and be recognized and complimented for it. And her creation of Valkill Industries there was many good New Deal reasons for it. There were many good reasons for it in terms of local employment, but a core romantic reason was to give her friend Nancy a place to blossom as well. And I think Val Kill is a place in which she learned how a people pleaser like herself, there were limits to what she could do to pleasing others, that it wasn't always going to work out, even if you gave all.
That's great. We're a little bit past the hour, but if it's all right with you, I'll just ask maybe 2 more. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great. So an unnamed questioner wants to know, how did Eleanor mix motherhood with her ambitions?
Oh, complicated and long question. Allida, do you have a leading line on that, or should I?
Well, I would just, I mean, you discussed this in great detail, and I do not have the skill to reconstruct personalities, but this is what I would say. Eleanor never had her mother. You know, her mother disdained her, thought she was a royal pain, was embarrassed by her, called her granny. So she never had affection and encouragement and stability that parenthood really demands. And her father was a drunk and a junkie. So she did not have any experience on how to be a parent. She didn't. All she saw was pain and disappointment from her family. And so parenting to her had to be learned. And she hoped that she could learn it from watching other people, reading, and that Sarah would help her. But David really goes into this, and so I defer this question to him.
I would say that everything that Allida just said is absolutely the foundation for why she used as her primary excuse. And I think of it as an excuse. It's a great rationale. It's also a wonderful philosophy, which is children must lead lives of their own. After a certain point, everything has got to be up to them. And she really felt compassionate for those kids, her own 5 children, when they moved into the White House, because she knew their lives were going to be forever changed and that they would be taken advantage of. And it's one of her more active moments in her parenting of grown children, is the steps she took to try to help them realize that they couldn't be casual, they couldn't be gullible, they couldn't be outlandish and risky, that they were going to get killed both. I mean, they were going to be, the press was going to nail them both ways, both if they were damned if they did and damned if they didn't. The Roosevelt boys, the sons, all served honorably in the military, but that didn't stop anybody from doubting every single thing they did during the war years and after, and to the point of cruelty. And Eleanor felt all that, and she was horrified by it. She felt, I think, always overwhelmed for exactly the reason that Allida said. She didn't really know how to mother, and mothering, I think she felt, and indeed was, more successful in the end with having an intimate relationship, or a closer relationship, I should say, with her daughter. But that was often because she was able to pick up with Anna on certain things that she couldn't with her sons. Particularly, for instance, Anna's second marriage, she became very close to Anna and her second husband. And she never really succeeded. She was wonderful with her daughters-in-law. Each individually, she created relationships, but she had a difficult time with her sons. Some of whom were like her father, some of whom weren't, some of whom she was able to understand better than others. She was always determined that they figure it out for themselves.
And then there was also Sarah, you know, because if some of the oral histories show that there was never a time ever that Eleanor tried to discipline her children that Sarah did not overrule. And FDR always sided with Sarah against Eleanor with the children. So there's a dynamic that's going on there. And as David, you know, really points out, when they grow to adulthood is when their relationships change. Although Eleanor does confide in Anna right when FDR is battling polio, and that helps thaw that relationship. And she's a fabulous grandmother. So.
Okay.
I'd add sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, David, please.
No, I just would add one thing, which is that in the middle of the night, if your child is crying in a crib and you go to that child, imagine a nurse standing there preventing you from picking the child up, and the nurse is in your mother-in-law's employ, father or mother, but particularly mother. And then you can't really pick your child up, and you're told what the child needs, and that the castor oil has already been given. She was absolutely cut out in infancy. And then just one last thing, which is she made a somewhat fatal error in having a favorite. If you have 4 sons, it's pretty difficult that one of them becomes the favorite. Yeah. And Elliot was a favorite, and she knew the weakness of it even as she fed into it. And so there's always a more human side to all of Eleanor's problems, and her responses to it, her willingness to forgive herself finally, is usually the deciding factor. Okay,
we will finish up with this last question from Deborah Heinrich. It's a question for both of you. First, she just thanks you for this wonderful presentation. And then she asks, what do you think it is about Eleanor that continues to fascinate and inspire people to this day? Allida, why don't you go first, and then we can finish with you, David.
Because Eleanor put herself out there in a way without much support, and began to really challenge herself to grow as she did it. And her vision, her heart and her visions are infinite. And I still find it just stunning that with all the horror and all the disappointment and all the unfulfilled expectations that she saw government confront, or, that pierce people's heart, that she still believed that we could make democracy work, and she didn't give up on people. And she risked all she had to do that. She braved assassination attempts, loss of income, character assassination, the rebuke of her mother-in-law, the disappointment of her children, to really risk herself for what she grew to firmly believe we could become. And I think that's an act of unstinting courage that resonates with people today.
Well said, Allida. One addition to that is I did come across so repeatedly, and it struck me the depth of it, the hatred that we see today there was in equal measure in the 30s. Eleanor was a target for that kind of hatred, and we know it now intimately from day to day, and have for the last 3 to 5 years. So that she could carry forward without being hurt herself personally by that hatred is a testament. I would say it's about an authenticity of spirit. You could not fake, you cannot fake what Eleanor was, what Eleanor had. It was never about her. It was about you. It was about you and me. It was about us, and it was about being, for her, it was about being with someone who was badly hurt and in pain, and feeling it, understanding it, helping them, feeling that there was something they could do, that something could be done, and that government itself had a place in people's lives and belonged to people, and would make a better life for all in the best of all possible worlds. She never, I think, gave up on democracy and on its reciprocity, and she remains both a spirit, an authentic one, but also I think she captured people's hearts. And when you see posters and so forth on people's walls saying that the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams, and the quotes that we know of Eleanor, she is inhabiting our national spirit. She's inhabiting our soul, and she has a place there that can't be taken away.
That's a fantastic place to finish. Thank you both, David and Allida. This has been great. We should say goodbye. Do you have a final word?
Well, I
Take
want to thank-
care, everybody. Stay safe.
and don't forget to vote.
See you soon, David.
See you soon, Allida. Thank you so much.